Okay, so I want you to imagine a city. But, well, this isn't just any city.
Definitely not a human one.
Right, definitely not. Imagine this sprawling subterranean metropolis, right? And it's just teeming with millions of inhabitants. But here is the massive catch.
The catch that completely breaks our brains.
Exactly. The city has no mayor. There is no police force. I mean, there are no traffic lights, no municipal codes, no blueprints, and like absolutely zero central planning committee.
None. Nobody is in charge.
But despite the total absence of anyone giving orders, this city runs with this perfect, almost terrifying efficiency. Waste is managed perfectly. Food is distributed to the exact calorie.
Infrastructure gets rebuilt dynamically, just, to match the weather.
Yeah, and armies can be mobilized in seconds. It's wild.
It really is. I mean, we humans have this very specific playbook for how a society is supposed to function, right? We like the things to be visible. We like things categorized and, well, managed top down.
We need a boss.
Exactly. We need a boss. If a bridge needs building, somebody drafts a blueprint, an executive signs off on it, and then a foreman directs the workers. But when you step into the world of eusocial insects, you basically have to take that entire playbook and just throw it out the window.
Just toss it entirely.
Yeah, because the structure of their reality is entirely alien to our own. It relies on mechanisms that challenge, like, every fundamental assumption we have about intelligence and organization.
Which is exactly our mission for today. So welcome to the deep dive, you, our fellow learner. Today, our goal is to completely dismantle how you think about intelligence, society, and, honestly, even your own daily routines.
We are getting into some truly mind-bending stuff today.
We really are. We're cracking open this incredibly fascinating piece of academic literature from July 2026. It's this ethological thought experiment titled Smell, Work, and Collective Mind. What would your day be like if you were an ant?
It's such a brilliant paper.
It is, but I want to be clear right up front, this isn't a cartoon. We're not, putting a tiny little hard hat on an ant and having her punch a time card.
Right. No Disney movies today.
No Disney. This is a rigorous, scientifically grounded reconstruction of 24 hours in the life of a generalized temperate zone worker ant. It takes decades of hard science stuff like sensory ecology, circadian rhythms, pheromone communication, and weaves it all into this continuous biological narrative.
And the foundational shift you need to even begin to understand this thought experiment is realizing that an ant is not an individual. Not in the way we think of individuality, anyway.
Right, you can't just look at one ant.
No, you absolutely cannot look at a single worker and understand her actions in isolation. The core concept here, the thing you have to grasp, is the superorganism.
A superorganism. It's such a total paradigm shift.
It is. The colony itself is the organism. The individual ants, they are merely the cells making up that organism.
So, like, when an ant eats a crumb of food, it isn't just an individual enjoying a nice meal. It's much more like a red blood cell absorbing oxygen so it can transport it somewhere else.
That is the perfect analogy. And following that logic, the queen isn't a monarch. She is just the reproductive tissue.
And the nest architecture is basically the skeleton and the skin.
Exactly. So to truly understand this, we have to kind of shrink our perspective down. We have to put ourselves inside the physical reality of this worker ant. And the physics at that scale, well, they're just profoundly different from what we experience.
Because scale dictates literally everything about their existence.
Everything.
Yeah.
Because they are so small, we're talking just a few millimeters long, the physical forces that dominate our everyday lives are basically negligible to them. But the forces that we completely ignore, those become existential threats.
Give me an example of that.
Well, gravity, for instance. Gravity is barely an issue for an ant. Their mass is so incredibly low compared to their surface area that terminal velocity just isn't lethal.
Wait, so it can't die from falling?
Basically, no. An ant can fall out of an airplane at cruising altitude, hit the pavement, and just dust itself off and walk away.
That is insane.
It's just physics. But then you have surface tension. For us, surface tension is nothing. You get out of a swimming pool, you dry off with a towel, you don't even think about it.
But for an ant?
For an ant, surface tension is an absolute nightmare. Water is like viscous glue. A single tiny dewdrop on a blade of grass is this highly dangerous sticky lake. The surface tension of that water is actually strong enough to trap their legs and drown them.
Wow. So their environment is overwhelmingly physical and tactile. I mean, to an ant, a crack in the pavement isn't a tripping hazard. It's a fully enclosed, shaded canyon corridor.
Right, and a single grain of sand is a boulder that they have to physically climb over or navigate around.
And their internal biology is just as constrained by that scale, isn't it? Like how they breathe?
Yeah, their breathing is fascinating. They don't have lungs. Mammalian lungs require this massive internal volume to function, which an ant simply does not possess.
So how are they getting oxygen?
They rely on this passive respiratory system made of tracheal tubes. Basically, they have these tiny little openings along the sides of their exoskeleton called spiracles.
Spiracles, okay.
Yeah, and these spiracles pipe oxygen directly into their tissues. The air just diffuses in.
It sounds super efficient on paper, but reading through the source material, it actually seems like a massive double-edged sword.
Oh, it completely is.
Because those tubes are just constantly open to the air, right? So they must be highly susceptible to moisture loss. Like they are constantly bleeding humidity into the atmosphere.
Exactly. They are locked in this perpetual, lifelong battle with desiccation. Their exoskeleton is this brilliant suit of armor, sure, but their high surface area to volume ratio means they can literally dry out and die in a matter of minutes.
Minutes, just from being in the sun.
Yeah, if they are exposed to direct sunlight or a dry wind, they just desiccate. So every single movement they make, every task they perform has to be constantly balanced against the metabolic cost of losing water through those spiracles.
So they live in a physical world that is simultaneously sticky, dangerously dry, and wildly out of proportion to their bodies.
It's a tough existence.
But honestly, it's their sensory world that I find the most staggering part of all this.
Oh, the sensory ecology is incredible.
Because when we think about navigating a dark space like a basement with the lights off, we just think of an absence of information, right? We're such visual creatures that the dark just feels empty.
But for a subterranean ant living deep inside a pitch-black nest, that darkness isn't empty at all. It is actually this incredibly loud, overwhelmingly dense landscape of data.
Because their primary interface with the world is entirely chemical. It's all mediated by their antennas.
Yes. And we need to give these antennas the credit they deserve. They're absolute marvels of evolutionary engineering. They are not just little noses smelling the air.
Right, they do so much more than that.
They are covered in thousands of these microscopic sensory hairs called sensilla. And each individual sensillum contains multiple receptor neurons.
And these neurons are tuned to specific molecules.
Specific molecules, yes, but also mechanical forces and even thermal gradients.
So it's basically a highly advanced 3D spatial sampling device. They're actively waving these antennas around, capturing this high-resolution map of the chemical world in real time.
Exactly. They can detect moisture gradients to figure out which way is deeper into the soil. They can read carbon dioxide levels in the air to measure the crowd density in a specific tunnel.
That's how they know if a room is too crowded.
Yes. But the absolute most crucial thing they read, the foundation of their whole society, is something called cuticular hydrocarbons, or CHCs.
CHCs. I've seen this term pop up before when reading about entomology, but the complexity of how they actually use it is just staggering.
It really is. So cuticular hydrocarbons are these complex, waxy lipid mixtures. They basically coat the entire outer skeleton, the cuticle of the insect.
Like a wax coating on a car.
Sort of. From a purely physiological standpoint, these waxes actually evolved just to help waterproof the ant. They act as a sealant to prevent that catastrophic water loss we were just talking about.
But evolution is just a master of repurposing things.
The ultimate recycler. Over millions of years, these chemical coats became the ultimate communication tool.
The paper describes it almost like a biochemical passport. A passport that also displays like your medical history and your current job title all at once.
That's a great way to put it. When an ant sweeps its antennas over the body of another ant in the pitch black, those little sensilla are physically binding to these waxy molecules.
So they aren't just thinking, oh, hey, I bumped into another ant. They are literally downloading an intricate data packet.
Right. And the neural processing happening in the ant's brain, specifically in this region called the mushroom bodies, is incredibly sophisticated. The ant reads the exact, precise ratio of all these different hydrocarbon chains.
And that ratio tells them what, exactly?
It allows her to identify the species. For one, it tells her whether the ant belongs to her specific colony, which caste the ant belongs to, and even physiological states.
Like if they're hungry or something.
Yeah, whether the ant is fertile, whether she's hungry, or even if she has recently been outside the nest and smells like the outdoors, all from a quick tap of the antennas.
They read this entire chemical barcode in a fraction of a second. It means the environment itself is just totally saturated with these lingering chemical signals.
It completely shifts how you have to think about a basic morning routine.
Let's actually get into that. If we start the clock on this 24-hour thought experiment, the dawn for our worker ant has absolutely nothing to do with sunlight. I mean, 3 feet underground, the sun doesn't exist.
No, there is no sunrise down there.
So how do millions of individuals know it's time to wake up and get to work?
The transition from rest to activity is driven entirely by the social pulse of the colony. So, as a few individuals begin to stir, and this might just be due to a slight temperature drop drawing some cooler air into the upper tunnels, or maybe the physical wriggling of a really hungry larva, they begin to walk around.
And as they move, they start bumping into their sleeping roommates.
Exactly. It's this cascading wave of physical and chemical stimulation. You feel a leg brush against you. You smell the specific cuticular hydrocarbons of an active awake worker. You sense the carbon dioxide levels shifting in the chamber as more ants start breathing heavier.
That is their sunrise, that wave of data.
That is the sunrise. But I actually have to stop you right there for a second because we really need to address a major preconception here. It always sneaks into these discussions.
Oh, about the queen.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is arguably the most persistent myth in all of biology.
Okay.
The idea that the queen is directing this awakening.
Right, because we hear the word queen and we immediately map human royalty onto the insect. We just assume she is the brain of the operation, sending out these chemical edicts telling everyone, wake up, time to start digging.
Like a grand architect sitting in her throne room, issuing pheromonal commands.
Right. But the paper makes it explicitly clear. She gives 0 orders. The queen is the ovaries of the superorganism, not the brain.
She is just a highly specialized reproductive factory. She literally just sits in a climate-controlled chamber, being cleaned and fed by nurses, converting protein into eggs all day.
But her pheromones do communicate stuff, right?
They do communicate vital information, yes, but they are broadcasts of her status. They signal her fertility, her physical presence, her overall health. They are not instructions on how to run the city.
So the workers react to her scent, but they are just responding to local stimuli, not following a royal decree.
Exactly. The entire superorganism survives simply because individual workers respond to whatever chemical or physical trigger happens to be placed directly in front of their antennas at that exact moment.
Okay, so our worker ant is awake. The social pulse in her chamber has reached a critical threshold. What is the very first thing she does? I mean, I would assume she immediately jumps into whatever her job is, digging, nursing, foraging.
You would think so, but no. The very first behavior is actually this incredibly meticulous self-care. She grooms.
Grooming. Right, which makes sense when you think about it.
It is an absolute physiological necessity. We just established that her entire perception of reality, her ability to navigate, recognize her sisters, find food, relies entirely on those sensillus on her antennas.
So if an antenna gets coated in dust or sticky soil or, worse, fungal spores, the ant effectively goes blind and deaf.
She'd be totally isolated from the network.
Yeah.
So she uses these specialized structures on her front legs, they actually have little combs built right into them, to meticulously scrape every microscopic piece of debris off her antennas and mouth parts.
It's like meticulously wiping the lens of a telescope before you try to look at the stars.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it. But it doesn't stop at self-cleaning. They also engage in ally grooming, which means they clean each other. And this is where we dive into this brilliant concept of social immunity.
Oh, I loved this part. Because consider the environment of the nest for a second. You have millions of organisms packed tightly into this enclosed, warm, incredibly humid subterranean space.
From an epidemiological standpoint, it is the absolute perfect breeding ground for devastating pathogens.
A total disaster waiting to happen.
Yes. Fungi, like Metarhizium for example, specialize in wiping out insect populations. They attach to the exoskeleton, or straight through the cuticle, and literally consume the host from the inside out.
Horrifying. So how do they not all die of the plague in, 3 days?
Mutual grooming is the answer. As they clean each other, they are actively scraping off infectious particles. But they aren't just mechanically wiping them away. They actually possess a specialized gland called the metapleural gland.
And what does it do?
It produces this highly complex cocktail of acidic, antibiotic, and antifungal secretions, and they actively spread the secretion all over themselves and their nestmates during the grooming process.
So it functions as this collective externalized immune system.
It does. But there is this fascinating, really high-stakes epidemiological risk calculation happening here. Because when a healthy ant grooms a nestmate that has been exposed to fungal spores...
The healthy ant gets exposed, right?
Exactly. The grooming ant inevitably ingests or comes into contact with a small number of those spores.
I was wondering about that. If you clean the sick roommate, you're going to get sick.
Normally, yes. But research suggests that by exposing themselves to a very low sublethal dose of the pathogen during grooming, The healthy ants might actually trigger a mild internal immune response.
No way. It acts as a form of social vaccination.
Basically, yes.
Hmm.
The colony is constantly dynamically balancing the risk of pathogen transmission against the absolutely critical necessity of keeping the overall fungal load in the nest below a fatal threshold.
They are literally inoculating their own population through hygienic interaction.
It's incredible.
It just blows my mind that a creature with a brain the size of a grain of salt is casually managing a decentralized vaccination program.
Nature finds a way.
So true. Okay, so once they are awake, clean, and inoculated, they have to interact. And in a crowded city of millions, verifying identity is paramount. We mentioned earlier that they use those cuticular hydrocarbons, the CHCs, as a chemical passport.
Right. Matching the scent of whoever they bump into against a template in their brain.
But the really wild part from the paper is that this colony odor isn't a static, permanent smell.
It can't be static. A colony is just way too dynamic. The overall scent of the nest is constantly changing based on what the foragers are bringing in to eat, the current humidity, the soil composition, and just the shifting demographics of the workforce itself.
So if the password was permanently hard-coded, half the colony would stop recognizing the other half as soon as the environmental inputs changed.
Exactly. So how do they stay on the same page? By constantly bumping into each other in these narrow tunnels and engaging in all that mutual grooming, they are physically transferring their waxy chemicals back and forth.
They're literally blending their individual scents to create this unified, constantly updating average.
Yes, it is a continuous homogenization process. When an ant compares the chemical profile of a sister against her neural template, she is basically looking for a match within a certain acceptable tolerance.
And if the profile matches, everything is cool. The interaction is peaceful.
But if an intruder from a different colony enters the nest, their hydrocarbon profile will be drastically different. This massive mismatch crosses a neurological threshold in the resident ant, instantly overriding the peaceful response and triggering extreme aggression.
The boundaries of their society are not the physical dirt walls of the nest. The boundaries are defined entirely by the limits of that shared chemical identity.
That is exactly right. Which brings us to perhaps the most mind-bending mechanism of this entire deep dive.
The social stomach.
Yes, they've bumped antennas, they've verified identity, the passwords match. Now they engage in a behavior called trophallaxis.
Trophallaxis, that's the mouth-to-mouth transfer of liquid food, right? I've actually seen macro photography of this. It's two ants standing face-to-face, jaws open, just passing a little droplet of liquid between them.
It looks like a very simple feeding behavior. But trophallaxis is actually the foundation of the colony's entire circulatory and logistical system.
How so?
To understand its importance, we have to look at the ant's internal anatomy. A worker ant possesses two stomachs. One is her own midgut, where she digests food for her own personal metabolic needs.
Normal stomach stuff.
Right. But preceding that is a specialized, highly expandable organ called the crop.
The social stomach.
Precisely. They are separated by a valve called the sternodial valve. When a worker is out foraging and drinks nectar, she keeps the sternodial valve closed.
So the sugar water just fills the social stomach and remains completely undigested. She is basically acting as a living cargo tanker.
A living tanker, exactly. So she comes back down into the dark nest, bumps into a hungry nurse ant, verifies her identity, and then literally regurgitates a fraction of that raw nectar into the nurse's mouth.
And the nurse swallows it into her own social stomach.
Yep. Then the nurse walks down the hall, bumps into another worker, and passes a fraction of that fraction along. Within minutes, a single drop of nectar gathered by one ant is distributed across a massive web of individuals deep inside the earth.
And here is where we bridge biology and systems theory. Because trophallaxis is not just a food delivery mechanism. It is a highly sophisticated, decentralized information network.
It really is.
I was reading about this exact network effect in the source material, and it immediately reminded me of a biological blockchain or like a decentralized ledger.
Oh, that's an interesting way to frame it.
Think about human supply chains, right? We need massive centralized spreadsheets and inventory management software just to track who is hungry, who has a surplus, and where the resources need to go. If a warehouse in Chicago is empty, someone has to send an email to the factory in Shenzhen to make more.
But the ant colony manages an infinitely complex supply chain without a single spreadsheet or manager. The entire system is regulated purely by local physical interactions.
Let's look at the mechanics of an empty colony. What happens when everyone is starving?
If the colony is starving, almost every ant's social stomach is completely empty. So when our forager finally returns with a full crop of nectar, she is immediately swarmed.
Every ant she bumps into is desperate for food.
Exactly. She unloads her entire cargo in a matter of seconds, usually just a few inches inside the entrance. And that rapid, immediate transfer is a physical stimulus.
It tells her something.
The speed at which she is drained tells her neurological systems demand is critically high. I must immediately turn around and forage for more.
But consider the opposite scenario. What happens when the colony is totally well fed?
When they're full, every ant's crop is physically distended. They have no room. So the forager walks in with her nectar, bumps antennas, and offers a droplet. But the receiving ant simply refuses. She physically cannot accept it.
So the forager just wanders deeper and deeper into the nest trying to give this food away, and she's just experiencing rejection after rejection.
And that persistent inability to unload her cargo serves as a direct, mechanical negative feedback loop.
The physical friction of the full network signals to her brain, the system is saturated. Stop foraging.
Exactly. She doesn't need a bird's-eye view of the colony's total caloric storage. The local interaction scales perfectly to achieve global resource management.
It is brilliant. And it's not just calories being traded in this biological blockchain, is it? The liquid passing between them is like a complex cocktail.
It is a rich biochemical soup.
Mm-hmm.
Alongside the carbohydrates, they are passing proteins, amino acids, and crucial signaling molecules like juvenile hormone.
So by analyzing the composition of the fluid received during trophallaxis, an ant can implicitly read the nutritional and developmental state of the entire colony.
It informs the nurses on how to feed the larvae, influencing whether a larva will develop into a small worker or a massive soldier. They are essentially drinking the status report of their society.
All right, so the network is humming, the social stomachs are processing data, and the immune system is actively scrubbing pathogens. But this city has a lot of heavy lifting to do. Tunnels need to be excavated, larvae need to be fed, trash needs to be hauled away.
There's always work to do.
Right, but if there is no foreman with a clipboard assigning shifts, how does the labor actually get divided? I remember reading older textbooks that framed ant societies as these rigid caste systems, like you're born a soldier, you die a soldier.
That is a very outdated view for most species. The rigid caste system is true for a few highly specialized ants, sure, but for the vast majority of them, the division of labor is incredibly dynamic and flexible.
So they don't have permanent job titles.
No. Instead, labor is allocated through a mechanism known as response thresholds.
I was thinking about this response threshold concept a lot, and it honestly reminds me of how people react to a messy kitchen.
Oh, do tell.
Well, in any given shared house, you have different breaking points, right? Some people have a very low threshold for a dirty kitchen. The moment a single coffee mug hits the sink, they feel this overwhelming urge to wash it.
They can't stand it.
Right. But other people have a very high threshold. They will literally let dishes pile up to the ceiling, balancing bowls on top of plates, before the visual stimulus finally breaks their tolerance and forces them to pick up a sponge. Is that essentially what's happening with the ants?
That is a remarkably accurate analogy, actually. Every individual ant possesses a genetically and epigenetically determined internal sensitivity to specific stimuli. Let's take the task of digging.
Okay, digging.
Imagine a minor cave-in blocks a high-traffic tunnel. The pile of collapsed soil emits a physical and chemical stimulus, a change in airflow, maybe the scent of disturbed earth.
So an ant with a low threshold for digging encounters that dirt, gets immediately overwhelmed by the stimulus, and starts moving the soil. She's the roommate who washes the single coffee mug.
Precisely. But what happens if the cave-in is massive? One ant with a low threshold isn't going to solve the problem quickly. The pile of dirt remains, and as more ants get bottlenecked behind it, the chemical and physical stimulus in that area intensifies.
The dishes are piling up.
The dishes are piling up. The stimulus grows so strong that it eventually crosses the breaking point of ants with a medium threshold for digging. Suddenly, ants who were previously just standing around or grooming themselves will drop what they are doing and join the excavation effort.
And if the stimulus continues to rise, even the ants with the highest resistance, the ones who let the dishes reach the ceiling, will be forced to join in.
Exactly. The environment itself recruits the exact number of workers required based purely on the intensity of the problem. Once the dirt is cleared, the stimulus evaporates, and the ants naturally disperse back to other tasks.
It's just a beautifully self-regulating system, and the research indicates that these thresholds aren't even permanent, right? They shift over the course of an ant's life.
Yes, through a process called age-related polyethism. Geography and chronology are intimately linked in the nest. When an ant is newly hatched as a young adult, she typically remains deep inside the safest, most humid chambers of the nest.
Down with the babies.
Right. Because she is physically located in the brood chambers, she is constantly bombarded by the chemical signals of the eggs and larvae. Her environment naturally forces her to be a nurse.
Because her thresholds for brood care are easily met by her surroundings.
Exactly. But as she ages, older cohorts gradually push her toward the periphery of the nest. And as she moves outward, the stimuli change. She encounters the scent of the outside air, the chemical trails of returning foragers, the changing temperatures.
So her internal biology reacts to this new physical location, shifting her thresholds entirely.
By the time she is an older worker, she has transitioned into being a guard at the entrance and eventually a forager. Her job is an emergent property of her age, her biology, and exactly where she happens to be standing.
Which perfectly explains who does the work. But it still leaves the mystery of how the work is coordinated. Like, if the environment is recruiting the workers, how do thousands of uncoordinated individuals build a masterpiece of subterranean architecture without a blueprint?
It's a great question.
They build these intricate archways, spiraling ramps, and deep vertical shafts. The paper explains this through a concept called stigmergy.
Stigmergy. It is arguably one of the most powerful concepts in the study of complex systems. It translates roughly to inciting to work. It is the mechanism of indirect communication through the modification of the environment.
Let's break that down mechanically. Because in a stigmergic system, an action performed by one agent alters the local environment, and that alteration becomes the specific stimulus for the next action.
Right. Think of an ant walking along with a single grain of soil in her mandibles. She doesn't have a mental map of a wall she is trying to build.
So why does she drop that specific grain of soil exactly there?
She drops it because she encounters a very specific local trigger. Perhaps she senses a sharp gradient in humidity, or she detects the lingering pheromone left by another ant who dropped a grain of soil in that exact spot just a millisecond ago.
So by dropping her soil, she adds to both the physical structure and the chemical signature of that microscopic location.
Exactly. So the next ant comes along, senses that slightly taller, slightly more chemically intense pile of dirt, and her neurological programming simply says, strong dirt stimulus. I must place my dirt directly on top of it.
They are executing these incredibly simple local algorithms. If I sense a small pile of dirt with pheromone X, deposit my dirt on top. If the pile reaches height Y and the humidity drops, stop depositing.
And when you run that simple algorithm millions of times in parallel, utilizing thousands of workers, complex architecture just emerges spontaneously. They aren't building a wall. They are just responding to the edge of the previous dirt pile.
It's the exact same logic Tomites used to build those massive cathedral mounds in Africa, right?
The exact same. The structure builds itself through a feedback loop between the insects and the material.
The paper even describes the resulting nest not just as a static home, but as a living lung. They use the stigmergic architecture to dynamically control the climate.
Because the metabolic requirements of the colony are incredibly narrow. The brood, the eggs, larvae, and pupa are highly susceptible to temperature fluctuations and desiccation.
So the workers are constantly monitoring the microclimates of the chambers.
Constantly. If the ambient temperature rises too high, workers will begin excavating new ventilation shafts to let the heat escape. If it gets too dry, they plug holes to trap moisture.
They basically act as a distributed collective thermostat, physically moving the larvae up and down the vertical shafts throughout the day to keep them in the optimal growth zone.
And the relationship between the adults and the larvae is a complex economic exchange in itself. We usually think of babies as just resource sinks, right?
Right, they just eat and sleep.
But in the ant colony, they play a functional role. The paper points out a division in nutritional processing. The adult workers are highly active. They need instant energy, which means carbohydrates like nectar. But the growing larvae need heavy building blocks, which means protein.
The colony balances these macronutrients with ruthless efficiency. The foragers bring back both. But here's the brilliant evolutionary workaround: adult ants, due to their narrow waist and internal anatomy, have a very difficult time digesting solid proteins.
They really do. They can't just chew up a dead grasshopper and absorb it easily.
Well, what do they do with the massive dead bugs they drag home?
They feed the solid protein chunks directly to the larvae. The larvae actually possess sexualized enzymes and a digestive tract capable of rapidly breaking down raw meat.
Okay.
So the larvae consume the solid insect, digest it, and then excrete a nutrient-dense amino acid-rich liquid back out.
Wait, they use their own babies as an external digestive tract.
They absolutely do. It is a symbiotic loop across generations.
Right.
The adults provide the raw material, and the larvae process it into a bioavailable liquid that the adults can drink.
The entire colony functions as a single distributed metabolic engine. That is incredible.
It's wild, isn't it?
Okay, so this is all beautifully efficient, but any city of millions generates waste. And more grimly, it generates dead bodies. In a humid, enclosed space, a rotting corpse is a biological time bomb. If a fungus blooms on a dead ant in the nursery, the entire generation is wiped out.
It's an existential threat.
So how does the superorganism manage the ultimate dirty job? The morgue.
This is a critical defensive function known as necrophoresis, the removal of the dead. And it operates on a purely chemical basis.
Right.
When an ant dies, it obviously stops moving. But lack of motion doesn't mean much in a dark nest where ants frequently take micronaps.
Right, you can't just look and see if they're breathing.
For a worker ant, death isn't a state of being, death is a smell.
I want to dig into the exact mechanics of this because I know E.O. Wilson did some legendary experiments on this exact behavior. What is the chemical trigger that tells an ant its sister is dead?
So when an ant dies, its cuticular hydrocarbons and internal cellular membranes begin to rapidly decompose. Within roughly 2 days, this decomposition process reliably produces specific fatty acids.
Chief among them being oleic acid, right?
Oleic acid and linoleic acid, yes. To a worker ant, the sensory binding of oleic acid to her antennal receptors is the absolute, unquestionable trigger for necrophoresis.
It trips that response threshold we talked about earlier.
Violently so. It creates an unstoppable neurological loop. The worker will pick up whatever object is emitting the oleic acid and carry it out of the active living areas, depositing it in a designated refuse pile or an isolated trash chamber.
And this is where E.O. Wilson's experiment comes in, right? Because it proves that they aren't mourning, they aren't checking for a pulse, they are literally just biological robots running an oleic acid script.
Yes, Wilson's experiment perfectly illustrates the mechanistic nature of their reality. He took a tiny droplet of synthetic oleic acid and painted it onto the exoskeleton of a perfectly healthy, living worker ant.
So you have a live ant walking around grooming, totally normal, but she smells like a corpse. What happened?
Her nestmates instantly perceived her as dead. Despite her struggling, despite her moving her legs and actively trying to communicate, her sisters aggressively picked her up and carried her to the graveyard, dumping her on the trash pile.
Because the chemical signal overrides all other physical evidence.
Completely overrides it. And the poor ant would clean herself off eventually, walk back into the nest, but if even a trace of the acid remained, they would pick her up and throw her in the trash again.
It proves that to an ant, truth is chemical.
It really is. What's even more fascinating from an epidemiological standpoint is how the colony handles the workers assigned to the graveyard. The ants that work the refuse piles, the ones managing the highest pathogen loads in the entire colony, are often socially isolated.
Social distancing.
Yes. The colony basically restricts their movement back into the pristine brood chambers, effectively compartmentalizing the dangerous work to protect the vulnerable core. It is a brutal, pragmatic form of public health.
Brutal and pragmatic is the perfect summary of ant economics, which transitions us perfectly to the most perilous phase of our worker's life.
Leaving the nest.
Yes. Eventually, the colony's internal needs, the collective hunger echoing through that social stomach network, pushes our worker ant toward the most dangerous threshold she will ever cross, the exit. Leaving the nest is the great filter.
The subterranean nest, despite the pathogens, is a highly controlled environment. The climate is regulated, structural integrity is maintained, predators are kept at bay. The outside world is the exact opposite. It is chaotic, unregulated, and incredibly lethal.
A completely alien landscape. But the paper makes a point that the decision to leave the nest isn't a personal choice. Our worker doesn't wake up feeling adventurous. The trigger to forge into the unknown is, like everything else, a socially calculated mechanism.
It relies heavily on the traffic feedback loops at the entrance. The foragers who are currently outside are constantly returning. If they're successful, they come back quickly, smelling of rich food. As they funnel through the narrow entrance tunnel, they physically bump into the older workers who are loitering in the staging area just inside the door.
So if 100 foragers rush in within 5 minutes, bumping into everyone, dropping off nectar, that high-frequency physical contact acts as a stimulant. It tells the waiting ants, the weather is good, food is plentiful, get out there.
Exactly. But if the weather turns bad, or maybe a predator is hunting near the entrance, the returning traffic drops to zero. The lack of physical bumping and the absence of fresh food scent causes the stimulus to decay. The waiting ants naturally stay inside.
They calculate the state of the outside world without ever even looking at the sky.
It's all done at the doorway.
But when our ant does step outside, the scale of the threat is terrifying. She is immediately exposed to desiccating wind, blinding UV radiation, raindrops the size of cars, and an absolute gauntlet of predators, spiders, birds, lizards, and rival ant colonies.
The mortality rate is staggering.
Which brings us back to the gerontology of ant labor. We touched on age-related polytheism earlier, but there is a deeply pragmatic evolutionary reason why it is the oldest ants who are sent out into this meat grinder, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. It is the brutal calculus of evolutionary economics, heavily tied to kin selection theory. An ant colony essentially treats its workforce as depreciating assets.
Depreciating assets, wow!
A newly hatched worker has her entire lifespan ahead of her. She represents a massive amount of potential labor months of nursing, digging, and maintaining the nest. She has high future value.
She is an investment the colony needs to protect.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But an old worker whose mandibles are worn down from digging and whose energy reserves are fading has very few days left to live anyway. Her future value to the colony is mathematically near zero.
So because foraging in the outside world is so inherently lethal, it is an evolutionary imperative to risk only the individuals whose loss will have the least impact on the colony's overall productivity.
The colony sends its senior citizens into battle because they are expendable.
Wow. Just wow. So our expendable elderly worker ant steps out into the blinding light. She survives the spiders. She avoids the raindrops. But survival isn't just about not getting eaten. It's about not getting lost.
Navigation is key.
She has to find food in a vast desert and bring it back to a hole in the ground the size of a dime. The navigation systems described in this paper absolutely broke my brain. It's called path integration, and we need to explore this deeply because it implies they are doing real-time calculus.
Path integration is one of the most stunning cognitive feats in the animal kingdom. When the ant leaves the nest, she does not walk in a straight line. She is searching. She zigzags wildly. She loops around obstacles. She gets blown sideways by a gust of wind. Her outbound path is a chaotic, tangled mess of a route.
But the moment she finds a crumb of food, she doesn't retrace her chaotic steps. She turns around and walks in an absolutely perfect straight line directly back to the nest hole. How is a creature with a brain the size of a pinhead doing vector mathematics?
She achieves this by continuously calculating a home vector in real time, utilizing two distinct streams of data that she integrates in a specialized neural region called the central complex.
Okay, what's the first stream?
Distance. She needs to know exactly how far she has walked.
Wait, does she have a biological pedometer?
She literally counts her steps. She integrates the proprioceptive feedback, the physical sensation of movement and joint position from every single stride she takes. The absolute proof of this comes from a legendary experiment conducted on Cataclyphus desert ants by a researcher named Rudiger Weiner.
The stilt experiment. Oh, I need you to explain exactly how they did this because it sounds like a practical joke played by scientists.
It really does, but it is a masterclass in experimental biology. Weiner wanted to prove they were counting steps, so he let a group of ants run out of their nest to a feeder, allowing them to calculate their home vector. Then he captured them at the feeder and modified their legs.
How do you even modify an ant's legs?
With extreme precision and superglue. For one group, he carefully glued tiny pig bristles to the bottoms of their legs, effectively putting the ants on microscopic stilts.
Microscopic stilts.
Yes, this artificially lengthened their stride. For another group, he amputated the lower portion of their legs, forcing them to walk on stumps, which shortened their stride.
And then he released them to see how they would navigate home based on the vector they calculated with their normal legs on the way out.
The results were perfectly mathematical. The ants on stilts, taking much longer strides than their brains were calibrated for, overshot the nest hole significantly. Their internal pedometer counted the right number of steps, but the distance covered was too great.
And the ones on stumps.
Conversely, the ants on stumps, taking tiny strides, undershot the nest. They stopped and started frantically searching for the hole long before they actually reached it.
That is just... We need supercomputers to do what they do by accident, so they are tracking distance perfectly. But a vector requires distance and direction. How does she know what angle she is walking at, especially when she's spinning around dodging rocks?
For direction, she uses a celestial compass. But she doesn't just look at the sun like a human navigator might. The compound eyes of an ant, specifically the ommatidia at the top of their eyes, are specialized to see the polarization patterns of light in the sky.
So even if the sun is hidden behind a cloud, the blue sky itself displays a geometric pattern of ultraviolet and polarized light that indicates the sun's exact position.
Exactly. By continuously updating how many steps I just took against my current angle relative to the polarized light pattern, her central complex performs continuous trigonometric integration. The home vector is a constantly shifting arrow in her mind, always pointing directly at the front door.
But the paper notes that path integration isn't infallible. I mean, if she goes on a massively long foraging trip, taking millions of steps, tiny micro errors in her stride length or compass reading can accumulate. Her internal gyro can drift.
True.
So she doesn't rely on it exclusively. She combines the math with visual memory.
Right. The ant is constantly taking mental snapshots of the panoramic skyline. As she leaves the nest, she turns around and memorizes the jagged edge of a distant rock or the dark silhouette of a bush against the sky.
It's like when your GPS says you have arrived, but you're in the middle of a generic street. So you look up from your phone and search for the red door your friend told you to look for.
That is precisely how they use it. If her path integration leads her to the general area of the nest, but she is a few inches off and can't find the hole, she stops relying on the pedometer. She begins to rotate, comparing her current visual field to the stored panoramic snapshots in her brain.
She moves until the jagged rock and the dark bush align perfectly with her memory, locking her into the exact coordinates of the nest entrance.
The robustness of the system is just staggering. If a scientist moves the rock, she might be confused for a moment, but she immediately falls back on her path integration or the smell of the nest to correct herself. She has redundant backup systems.
So she's used her internal compass, navigated the alien landscape, and finally, survival pays off. She finds calories. But this brings us to the economics of foraging. She doesn't just blindly grab the first thing she finds. The paper emphasizes that she performs an incredibly rapid, multivariable cost-benefit analysis.
Because foraging is an exercise in optimization. Every calorie expended has to yield a massive return on investment for the superorganism. Let's say our worker stumbles upon a droplet of honeydew secreted by an aphid. She doesn't just start drinking. She evaluates the resource.
She tastes it with the sensilla on her mouthparts to determine the sugar concentration. She measures the volume of the droplet, but she is also reading the environment. She's asking, how dangerous is this location?
Risk assessment is critical here. While evaluating the sugar, her antennas are scanning for the cuticular hydrocarbons of rival aggressive ant colonies. She is detecting the chemical residue of spider silk. She is feeling the radiant heat of the soil to ensure she won't desiccate before she finishes drinking.
So if it's a weak, watery drop of sugar, but the area reeks of spider pheromones, she bails. The return isn't worth the risk.
Exactly.
But if she finds a massive, highly concentrated pool of nectar in a safe, shaded area, she drinks until her social stomach is distended. And then she initiates the recruitment protocol.
This is where we see the famous pheromone trails in action. As she runs back to the nest using her path integration vector, she periodically touches the tip of her abdomen to the ground, deploying a glandular secretion, a chemical breadcrumb.
But it's not a binary signal. It's not just food here. The trail contains economic data.
Right. The intensity of the chemical she lays down is directly modulated by her evaluation of the food. If it was a life-changing amount of sugar, she pumps out a heavy, dense pheromone trail. If the food was just mediocre, she drops a faint, sparse trail.
She is essentially ranking the resource for her sisters. So when she bursts into the nest, smelling of high-quality nectar, she excites the resting foragers. They rush out of the tunnel, their antennas immediately detecting the chemical gradient on the soil.
And following it is a feat in itself.
How do they actually follow the invisible line? Do they walk directly on top of it like a tightrope?
They follow it using their antennas in stereo, much like how a tracking dog uses its two nostrils to determine the direction of a scent. As the ant runs, she rapidly sweeps her antennas left and right across the path.
Okay, scanning back and forth.
If her left antenna detects a weaker concentration of the pheromone than her right, her brain instantly computes that she is drifting off the left edge of the trail. She reflexively corrects her steering to the right.
So they zigzag back and forth across the chemical boundaries, funneling themselves toward the target at high speed. And as more ants reach the giant pool of nectar, drink, and run back, they lay down their own pheromone trails on top of the original one.
It creates a powerful positive feedback loop. The more ants that find the food, the stronger the trail becomes, which recruits exponentially more ants. The colony rapidly mobilizes a massive workforce to drain the resource before a competitor finds it.
But this positive feedback loop presents a massive logistical danger. If they just keep reinforcing the trail, making it louder and louder, what happens when the nectar finally runs out?
That's a huge problem in human systems.
Exactly. Think about human systems. Think about how much bad data, how many obsolete processes we hold on to in corporate structures or governments, because our trails never evaporate. We get stuck doing things the old way long after the utility is gone. Doesn't the ant colony get trapped in a permanent loop of sending thousands of workers to an empty spot in the dirt?
This is where the physical chemistry of the pheromone is brilliant. The pheromones they use for foraging trails are highly volatile. They are designed by evolution to evaporate rapidly at room temperature.
The evaporation is a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. The environment automatically erases obsolete data. When the nectar pool is finally drained, the ants that arrive find nothing to drink. Because their social stomachs are empty, their behavioral algorithm dictates that they do not lay down pheromones on the walk home.
So the positive reinforcement stops.
And because the chemical is highly volatile, within minutes the existing trail simply evaporates into the air. The signal disappears entirely. The highway dissolves.
The colony immediately ceases sending labor to an empty resource, preventing a catastrophic waste of metabolic energy. Forgetting is functionally necessary for the superorganism to remain agile.
It's incredible.
It is, and the physical world does the data management for them. But let's shift gears from liquid nectar to solid prey. What if our forager finds a dead grasshopper? She can't drink it, and she certainly can't carry a massive insect by herself.
No, she needs help.
The paper describes a cooperative transport scenario that is both physically complex and, frankly, hilarious to visualize. The tug of war.
Cooperative transport of large prey is a fascinating display of decentralized physics. A scout finds the grasshopper, lays a trail, and recruits a dozen sisters. They all swarm the dead insect. They bite onto a leg, an antenna, a wing.
But they do not possess the cognitive ability to form a team huddle, elect a leader, and say, okay, the nest is to the north. On 3, everyone pull north.
They just grab and pull. Initially, it is complete uncoordinated chaos. Every ant is relying on her own internal path integration vector, which might be slightly off. One ant pulls left, another pulls right, 3 push from the back. The dead grasshopper just vibrates and spins in circles.
So how do they ever get it home? How does the chaos organize into a directed effort?
The coordination emerges entirely through the physical tension transmitted through the body of the prey itself. The grasshopper acts as a mechanical communication channel.
Really? Through the tension?
Yes. As they pull, an ant that feels she is fighting against the overwhelming resistance of the majority might let go, reposition herself, and grab a different leg where the tension aligns better with her internal compass.
And there is a dynamic where new, informed ants arrive to break the stalemate, right?
Exactly. Ants that have just arrived via the pheromone trail have a very fresh, highly accurate memory of the nest's direction. Their pulling force is highly directed.
Oh, I see.
The ants that have been struggling for 10 minutes might yield to this new, informed directional pull. Through these tiny, continuous physical microadjustments, the vectors eventually align, and the giant carcass begins to slide smoothly across the desert floor toward the nest. It is consensus achieved through mechanical friction.
They communicate through the tension of the dead bug. It's so cool. And it's important to note that they aren't just blindly seeking food. The paper's expert analysis points out that the superorganism learns from negative information just as effectively. A society has to map out what to avoid to survive.
Ants construct dynamic fear maps of their territory. If a forager is exploring a new area and is attacked by a spider, or has a violent skirmish with a patrol from a neighboring colony, she obviously flees. But she retains the spatial coordinates of that traumatic event via her path integration.
She doesn't just run away and forget. She actively flags the area in her mind.
When she goes out on her next foraging trip, she will actively steer her search patterns away from the coordinates of the negative encounter.
The colony's collective foraging footprint shifts dynamically, balancing the caloric reward of an area against the demographic cost of losing workers to combat or predation in that zone. They utilize negative data to shape a safe supply chain.
It's all about efficiency.
All right, so our successful foragers have survived the spiders, pulled the massive grasshopper home, and followed the evaporating highways. Now, thousands of them are rushing back to the nest entrance simultaneously.
Which is a huge problem.
It creates a massive logistical nightmare. You have bodies moving at high speed in both the directions through a dirt tunnel that is only a few millimeters wide. Anyone who has sat in rush hour traffic knows that density equals gridlock. How does this not result in a perpetual, catastrophic traffic jam?
Well, the physics of ant traffic flow actually diverge significantly from human traffic flow. In a human traffic jam, when density reaches a certain point, cars have to stop. That stop cascades backward, creating a wave of gridlock. Ants manage massive density without central lights or painted lanes, using incredibly simple local rules.
The paper notes they spontaneously form dedicated lanes.
They do. On heavily trafficked pheromone trails or inside the main entrance tunnels, incoming and outgoing ants will spontaneously segregate into separate parallel lanes.
Just automatically.
Yeah, this isn't because a central authority mandated a right-hand drive system. It emerges from collision avoidance. When ants bump head-on, it slows them down. By drifting slightly to the side of the highest concentration of head-on collisions, lanes naturally materialize, maximizing the flow of bodies.
But they do bump into each other occasionally, and the paper details a micro-negotiation that happens during those collisions. Sometimes an empty-handed ant will yield the right-of-way to an ant carrying a heavy load of food.
It is a beautifully efficient economic rule embedded in their behavior. An empty-handed outgoing forager is light and highly maneuverable. An incoming forager dragging a piece of a caterpillar is encumbered and possesses massive forward momentum.
So when they meet head-on and quickly touch antennas, the empty worker instinctively sidesteps, yielding the central path to the loaded worker.
She gets out of the way of the heavy lifter. By yielding, she ensures that the colony's caloric intake is not delayed by friction. Just by following a simple local rule, avoid head-on collisions, and step aside if the other ant is heavy, the collective achieves a fluid infrastructure that puts our highway systems to shame.
They increase their speed as density increases, right up to a critical point, maintaining a uniform flow instead of succumbing to stop-and-go waves.
Yeah,
I am definitely taking notes for my next commute. Just step aside for the heavy lifting.
exactly.
Okay, so our ant makes it inside. She navigates the traffic, unloads her nectar into the biological blockchain, and drops her piece of the grasshopper off for the larvae to digest. The test stimuli around her drop below her response threshold. She has no immediate job. Does she just turn around and run back out to the desert?
A lot of people think so.
Right. We always hear the fable of the tireless, industrious ant who never stops working.
That fable is entirely a human projection. The concept of the tireless worker is fiction. Ants absolutely sleep. However, their architecture of rest is vastly different from a mammalian circadian rhythm.
So they don't put on tiny pajamas and clock out for 8 solid hours of deep REM sleep. The paper categorizes it as polyphasic sleep.
Correct. When a worker's response thresholds are no longer being triggered, the colony is fed, the tunnels are intact, there's no chemical alarm, she enters a state of rest. But studies on species like fire ants reveal that this rest is broken up into hundreds of tiny, discrete episodes throughout the 24-hour cycle.
So they invented the ultimate power nap.
A worker might take over 200 micronaps a day, each lasting only a minute or two. This results in perhaps 4 to 5 total hours of rest, fragmented into tiny slivers of inactivity.
And the queen.
The queen, due to her protected status and massive metabolic output, sleeps much longer and deeper, but the workers remain tethered to the polyphasic cycle.
Now, you might look at a cross-section of a nest and see thousands of ants just standing around dozing and think, wow, half the workforce is lazy. But the paper speculates that this inactivity is highly strategic. It is a feature of the superorganism's survival plan.
Think about the evolutionary environment. An ant nest is subject to catastrophic, unpredictable events. A sudden flash flood could collapse the upper tunnels. An anteater could rip the roof open. A rival colony could launch a massive invasion.
If all the workers slept heavily for 8 hours at the same time, the colony would be defenseless.
They would be wiped out in their sleep. By utilizing polyphasic sleep, the colony ensures that at any given second, a large percentage of the workforce is awake and active. But more importantly, the massive population of lightly dozing ants acts as an elastic reserve labor force.
A biological standing army just waiting in the wings.
Precisely. Because they are only lightly resting, they can be instantly mobilized. If the nest is breached, the active guards release an alarm pheromone. The chemical wafts through the chamber, crossing the sensory thresholds of the resting ants.
Instantly, thousands of workers wake up, shift from a state of zero activity to maximum aggression, and swarm the breach.
The superorganism can dynamically scale its labor force from 10% to 100% in a matter of seconds without having to pull critical workers off of nursing or structural maintenance.
The inactivity is strategic elasticity. That is a profound way to view rest. Okay, we have covered an immense, staggering amount of biological ground today.
We really have.
We started this thought experiment by shrinking down to the millimeter scale. We woke up in a dark, humid world defined entirely by chemical layers and physical friction. We cleaned our sensory arrays to hold back the fungal tide.
We shared our social stomach.
Yes, acting as a single node in a massive, decentralized supply chain, we built complex architecture just by reacting to the exact height of a dirt pile. We survived a lethal desert by doing vector calculus with our footsteps, and we pulled massive prey home through mechanical consensus. We yielded in traffic, and we ended the day taking hundreds of strategic micronaps.
It is a radically alien existence. It is a life defined entirely by the immediate present, by the specific chemical binding to an antenna, by the tension of a mandible on a dead leaf, by the physical bump of a sister in the dark.
The ant has no concept of the whole.
No, she does not know what a colony is. And yet, through these microscopic, local, immediate reactions, she helps construct a superorganism that outlives, outbuilds, and outcompetes almost anything else on the planet.
Which brings us to the final thought I want to leave everyone with for this deep dive. The stated mission at the very beginning of this episode was to dismantle how we think about intelligence, organization, and our own society. We've looked at the biology. So where does this leave us philosophically? What is the core takeaway for the human observer?
If we look closely at human societies, we are profoundly obsessed with centralization and the illusion of control. We inherently believe that in order to solve complex, large-scale problems, we require rigid hierarchies, brilliant leadership, comprehensive blueprints, and top-down management.
When a system fails, when traffic snarls, when supply chains break, when architecture crumbles, our immediate instinct is to blame the person in charge or demand a new, stronger central authority.
We always look to the top of the pyramid for the solution. Yet the ant colony achieves perfect resource distribution, dynamic and sustainable architecture, highly optimized traffic flow, and complex defensive strategies without a single manager.
No one has the big picture.
No one is in charge. The entire majestic complexity of their society emerges spontaneously from local interactions, individual response thresholds, and simple physical feedback loops.
So if millions of tiny insects can thrive for millions of years, adapting to catastrophic changes without a single executive order, what does that say about our own human assumptions regarding power, hierarchy, and how a society supposedly has to be run? That is a question that is going to linger with me for a long time. We always assume that the mayor is the reason the city runs, but looking at the ants, maybe the city runs in spite of the mayor. If you want to build a perfect, resilient society, maybe you don't need endless laws, central databases, or traffic lights. Maybe you just need a system where everyone pays incredibly close attention to the environment and to whoever happens to be standing right next to them. Thank you, our fellow learner, for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep looking down. There is an entire flawlessly executed universe functioning right beneath your feet.